Perfect. Okay, so I'll start. Again, everyone, welcome to this third talk of the interiors lecture series for this spring. We're really well. At least I am very happy to have Just Boys here with us. As you may know, this is a Women's History Month, and so Just has a very important role to play in the, or as played a very important role in thinking about gender and the built environment by being one of the co-founder of Matrix Feminist Design Cooperative in the 80s in London. She now works at the Bartlett, where she also studied at University College London. I won't say much because we never do very big introductions here, but I think, or thinking about the relation or how design can help disadvantaged people is really important. It ties into a lot of the things that we are interested in here at Arizona State University. So I think our work will be an inspiration for all of you. And I just wanted to share something. So I've been following our work for many years. It's a big inspiration. And a few years ago, I was at a conference, and we had kind of a symposium, and we had a workshop at the beginning. And I knew just through her writings, but I didn't know what she looked like. And so I was at the table, and we're doing the workshop, and I was really admiring what this person that was at the table was saying, and we had not been introduced by her name. And then at the end, I realized that, oh, this is the person that I've been reading and learning so much from, and she's as great in person as she is in her writing. So when we were organizing this series, I was really excited that we could bring her virtually here to share our work with all of you. So I'm just gonna pass it to you. And
Thank you very much for that introduction. And I'm going to talk about the work of the DisOrdinary Architecture Project. I haven't really woven in much about matrix or gender, although I think starting from disability and difference brings in a lot of things around. It's inherently intersectional, and it brings in a lot of things around all those different areas in terms of our different ways of being in the world, the way society sees us, and how that affects the design of space and our occupation of space. So hopefully those things will come up. If they don't, I'm very happy for you to ask questions in the Q&A, and we can talk about those things as well. So on the assumption that you can see my slides.
Yes, we can.
Lovely, thank you. So what is the DisOrdinary Architecture Project? It's something that started we probably got going in about 2008, and it's led by disabled artists. I'm the token non-disabled person. I'm the token architect. So my role in May is a mediator, an ally, a translator. And because, although there are plenty of disabled people in architecture and interiors, it's something where it's actually not that safe to disclose, because it really affects both your education and your employment opportunities. When we were looking at gender in the 1980s in architecture and the built environment, it was much easier. There were women there. There weren't necessarily that many women, but there were women there. So this DisOrdinary Architecture came out of a meeting with a disabled artist who's my co-founder, Zoe Partington. And this was her idea, that if one could bring in disabled artists into education, into practice, as a way of sharing creativity and really opening up rather than closing down issues around disability and access. And that's been a fantastically enjoyable development, I think, for us at least. So why isn't this letting me move the slide on? Good. So back in 2008, we actually developed this kind of mission statement, and it's still completely central to what we do. So the DisOrdinary Architecture Project promotes activity that develops and captures models of new practice for the built environment led by the creativity and experiences of disabled artists. And that idea of models of new practice is really key. This is not about giving you better access guidance or acting as a consultant, telling you how to make buildings more useful for disabled people. It's about actually ourselves. It's about how we organize the discipline. It's about how we think about what we do. It's about recognizing that everything we do is already an embodied practice. And in that way, we can start to think about doing it quite differently. I'm going to quote myself here, but for me, I got involved in disability almost by mistake. And I think, and working with disabled artists, there's a very lively disabled artist, disability arts, disability activism, disability scholarship in both the UK and the States, some fantastic work in the States. And I think I just couldn't understand why disability was being treated so differently to gender or sexuality, for example. So I'm going to read this quote out. Disability as a concept and disabled people as a constituency continues to be assumed as completely separate from social or cultural politics. It is invisible in both avant-garde and mainstream architectural theories and practice and discourses, just as it is a persistent absence in critical and cultural theory more generally. It seems that we assume disability to be unable to bring any kind of criticality or creativity to the discipline of architecture. So I think that those two things, criticality and creativity, that's what we're really interested in. And many of you will know this, the way that disability and access is historically being dealt with within the built environment is through a kind of retrofitting. You design for normal people, and then you add on at the end these people who don't fit that model, and you do it through these incredibly banal, functionalist, and often inaccurate drawings, which you can use as a kind of template and just drop in to your existing scheme, so you don't have to think, you don't have to apply your imagination in the slightest. So DisOrdinary Architecture starts from somewhere quite different. As I say, we start from the creativity of disabled artists. On the screen is an image of two fantastic disabled artists, one unfortunately not with us anymore, Aaron Williamson and Catherine Aronello. The image shows somebody in a wheelchair and somebody sitting beside them, but with a bottle of champagne and ridiculous wigs and a kind of whole burlesque and face painted craziness. And this is part of a project they made many videos called The Disabled Avant-Garde Today. And the whole running joke is that if you're disabled, you can't possibly be avant-garde. And for me, that was really interesting. It was like, well, could we make disability so cool that people, you know, practitioners and students and educators really wanted to do it? Not just schemes, kind of special needs schemes, but something that was a really vital and kind of front end component of design. I'll come back to Aaron later because he works sometimes with DisOrdinary. But in order to think about disability in a different way, it means that we cannot separate it out from ability. They're not binary opposites, they're not even binaries, they're really complex and nuanced relationships. But I think it's really interesting as a non-disabled white woman myself, that it's really interesting to think about what kind of bodies or body minds, as Margaret Price calls them, are considered kind of ideal or normal in the society. What's it to be in society generally, or actually, what does it mean to be an architectural and interior designer? What sort of person are you meant to be? What are your characteristics? And who is it that doesn't fit that profile? So we have to look at how there is an embodiment, there's a kind of ideal embodiment of what it is to be an architect, or what it is to be a heterosexual man. And these things, they're stereotypes. They're not, you know, then we don't have to be like that, but we do have to live our relationship to those stereotypes. And then, as some of you may know, that, of course, is not just about individuals and individual preferences. It's about life chances in society more generally. Some of you may have played this or know about the privilege game. The privilege game is a way of showing that even if you start people on a line, all on the same line, if you start asking them questions related to the things that do disadvantage some people and advantage others, or as we often say, disable some and enable others. You don't have to be disabled by society. Then if you ask, if you're the child of a single parent, take 3 steps back. If you're a person of color, take 5 steps back. And then you begin to see through time, these are statistical, these questions have statistical validity, how people begin to be separated and who gets to be in the front and who gets to be at the back. So when I talk about disability and when the DisOrdinary Architecture Project works, we're always thinking of it in this much bigger way in terms of how the built environments works to disable some and enable others. And that, I'm going to suggest 4 big claims. I'll talk about them very briefly, but we might come back to them, because I'm trying to show how once you start thinking like this, the kind of standard ways of thinking about access or thinking about disabled people as, people to be pitied, who we must do the best things for, just starts us off in actually a really problematic place, and we need to start somewhere else. So the first big claim is that we need new attitudes and concepts about body-mind differences that celebrate our human variety. I'm really interested in how we might value our bio and neurodiversity and see it as something very rich and enlivening, not as something that's problematic. And one of the ways that we think about that is, rather than talk about disability and ability or about different kinds of functions, like you use a wheelchair or you're blind or you're deaf, we're really interested in this idea of fit and misfit. This comes from a disability studies scholar called Rosemary Garland Thompson. And she argues that fitting is about, and you can think about yourself. Each one of you can think, how much do you fit and misfit? Can you think of situations when you've very definitely misfitted? Because if your relationship to the built environment is pretty smooth, it doesn't come up and bite you very often, people aren't rude to you in the street, then if you fit that kind of smoothly, actually, for us, that's a problem. That means that things from which you could learn and be much more creative just aren't there. So having a body mind that fits smoothly with its material and social environment results in lack of taking notice of surroundings and assumptions of own unproblematic place in the world. And for us, that's the problem. Because if you're a misfit, that is, you have a non-normal body mind, whatever that might be, and I'm talking about societal definitions as well as just literal human differences, you have inherently to increase your creativity. You have to pay attention to, you have to negotiate social and spatial encounters. Your awareness is always turned on. And we would argue that that can be very frustrating and exhausting, but it also can be incredibly valuable as a creative act. And that disabled people actually are already creative experts, and it's a creative expertise that the built environment professions does not make good use of. I'm not going to talk very much about different sorts of languages, but different words and concepts, but I did just want to say one of the things that I think is really important about this way of thinking is you're not an able-bodied person trying to understand a disabled person. You're actually listening to what disabled people say and learning from the kinds of ways that very diverse disabled people talk about the world. And 3 concepts that I find very useful, much better than trying to divide people up by functional impairment categories and then somehow design a perfect solution, is the notion of crip time, recognizing the realities of time for different people, as they negotiate everyday activities and spaces. That's just literally the time it takes to do things. But at the same time, challenging pressures on all our bodies to be productive, to be obsessive about work, to be entrepreneurial, to be individualistic, and that we feel guilty if we're not. So there's something also quite radical about the notion of crip time. Spoon theory is another one. Spoons, it's like spoons of energy, and it's a way of talking about how your energy gets sapped by specific situations and spaces. So for me, that's a really interesting access need that often doesn't even get thought about. How much of the interiors or the architecture that we design sapping people's energy. And finally, there's an idea of care work, and I'll come back to this, but it is, there's a really powerful work going on in disability studies and activism and arts at the moment around seeing access actually as a form of collective love. That's both as an idea and as a form of practical organizing and support. So I will talk about that soon. Other words, I'm going to go on about words because I think they're very important. They often include, within the words, there's a whole lot of ideas and assumptions that we don't unravel. So we don't use the word, I don't use the word accessible, even though I think it's important, and we do talk a lot about improving access. But, you know, if we start thinking about environments that are sustaining or help us thrive or help us flourish, we have a kind of different way and a much broader way of understanding what it is that designers should be doing. I personally don't like the word empathy very much. This often raises people's hackles, but for me, empathy is something that one has as a kind of, you know, you have empathy for somebody else, for some other poor soul. You're empathetic towards them and you want to know what they're doing, but you don't have to change. Empathy means that you can just feel rather good about yourself because you have empathy, but the other person is kind of invisible in that process. And that's why I like words like solidarity or allyship. And the final word that I quite like to change is inclusion, which of course is very common. And again, we do use it, but again, including, it's like I'm here, you can't see me, but I am here. And what I can do is I can choose to include people. I can choose to bring them in with me. But I don't have to change. Again, the same thing. So within the field, the kind of activist end of disability studies, there are very strong notions. The word that comes up a lot is disability justice or spatial justice. So this idea of justice. So that's about changing the language. The second point is about starting from disability as a creative generator. I've already mentioned through the notion of misfitting that perhaps if one starts with the outliers, with the non-normative people, with, I heard somebody call it leading from the edges recently, that is itself creative. It's not some drain on design. It's actually a really creative activity. So how do we explore that? Well, first of all, by working directly with incredibly creative and often world-renowned artists. This is Naomi Lackmeyer. This is a piece she did at the Sydney Opera House. I'm sorry, I'm not describing these, but I've got too many slides, so that's my fault. I'll describe the ones that really matter. I'm showing, so there's just the sheer creativity of disabled artists. There's already plenty of very good examples out there, but they tend to get put in the, you know, politically correct, oh God, we have to do access box. So they're not necessarily things that you learn about. The slide shows 2 door handles on a museum for the blind in Tokyo. They're quite large. They're like large brass pebbles that rotate, and they've got quite rubbed. So they're kind of burnished, and they have braille on them. So they're kind of the size of your hand, and so that when you grip them, you feel the temperature of the air. And as you turn them, you can feel the braille against your palm if you need to be reading it. And one is set vertically and one is set horizontally. So there's a kind of really enjoyable thing about grip and how the two work together. This is an image of a handrail in a dance school by Herzog and de Meuron. There's varying degrees of appreciation of this, or enjoyment or resistance to it from many disabled people who've commented on it, but the handrail does a dance. So it gives you, as a person coming into this space, a really strong expression and sensory motion of the dance school. Another thing I think to learn from is what is often called life hacks in the disability world. The picture shows an elderly woman sitting on what in the UK are very typical cycle racks. So they're frames that you fix your bike to. And cities in Britain anyway are very keen on cycling. They're very keen on supporting that kind of energetic activity. And for me, it's really interesting that an old person who needs to sit down quite a lot, who doesn't have the spoons, is very creatively reusing something which is designed for a completely different audience. I won't talk about the other picture now. There's a very interesting designer that you may have come across who's based in Boston called Sarah Hendren. She's at Olin College. And this is a project she did called Slope Intersect. So here again, we have this notion of a life hack. What small adaptations can you make that just make getting around our towns and cities much better? And this is a very simple ramp. She loved the idea of bringing together two very different sorts of user groups, skateboarders and people who use wheelchairs. And this is a series of images of this ramp in use. And then here we have an image of a project. They use this ramp in many different places. They do a kind of crowdsourced mapping where they look at all the possible places that the ramp can be. The picture shows a map of Toronto with highlighting the places where you can just use it to get up onto a curb or get into a one-step shop. So it was about how you might just really increase the accessibility of a whole city. Somebody that works with DisOrdinary quite a lot is called Raquel Mezagui, and on the slide there's a picture of her in a kind of very late evening sun lying down on a bench. And she runs a project called A Crash Course in Cloud Spotting, the subversive act of horizontality. She's somebody with a chronic illness who's also a performer and dancer, and she's very interested in how one could make more places to lie down in public spaces, and how that being seen as a problem is one of these things about how space is designed for normals rather than for all of us. And this is a picture just of her. She does a lot of projects around lying down and how spaces change and how activities change when you can take on a lot of different bodily positions. We did a project in Copenhagen, and the student, very quick project, and the students made a whole series of resting places around the harbour. This one is somebody lying down on the ground with a taped bed, a taped outline of a bed which says bed with a view. So I'm trying to just get through just sort of offer you a whole series of examples really of this kind of notion of disability as a creator, and starting from difference as a creative generator. This is a project we did back in 2008. The picture shows a very famous column and a very steep set of steps just near Buckingham Palace. And we did a project with architect Matthew Lloyd to think about how you might have an access route at this place that wasn't just trying to hide or was trying to be as boring as possible. And so Matthew Lloyd, together with a disabled artist called Tony Heaton, a disabled sculptor, designed a water-driven lift which takes you up each step. This is a picture showing just the one prototype that we built. And the idea is that the whole experience of using this lift, it's on axis with the column. So it's just very proud of itself. And it's an experience, the idea is it's an experience everybody might enjoy. You move very slowly up and down, you view out over the park, over the Royal Park, and you have a moment of calm as the water comes cascading past you. So it's an idea that this is an experience in its own right. It's not just a functional route from one place to another. My third big claim is that starting from difference is not just a creative generator, but it's actually a very powerful critique of what is normal in society. It lets you unpick what it is when you're designing, what it is that you might be doing that disables some people and enables others. So it has the potential of a really positive impact. And we often use a technique called breaching. The slide shows somebody shopping, but with a, you may recognize them, in a boiler suit and with a weird face mask. So the idea of breaching is the way you find out about everyday social norms and rules is you slightly twist them and you see what happens. And of course, with a lot of disabilities, if they're visible, you're doing that whether you want to or not. And if they're invisible, then you may often do it sort of doubly, in that people have assumed that you will behave in a quote unquote normal way. Part of that disruption, that sense of breaching, one of the things that I really like doing is there's always an assumption that DisOrdinary architecture will work only in the design areas, in the studio, but actually we work a lot in history and theory and in technologies. We're kind of interested in how you can think about difference and disability in all sorts of settings. So this is a tutor at the University of Newcastle called Katie Lloyd-Thomas, professor there, with Naomi Lackmeyer, who you saw at the beginning under the balloons, doing a project around phenomenology and using that as a way of thinking about bodies differently. Probably over the last few years, we've got quite a lot of money from the Arts Council UK. And so we set the task of doing a lot of work into built environment education. We're now working much more with practices, but over the last 5 years, really, we focused on education. And this notion of breaching, really, just bringing artists into design education is itself so unusual that it can have a really powerful effect. This is Dave Dixon. As you can see, he has a prosthetic leg, and he's really interested in how people insist on seeing him as either a cyborg or somebody to be pitied. Oh dear, you lost your leg. And he's really interested in how difference itself can be disruptive. And so he does projects with us around different sorts of drawing, which you do by changing the shape of your body and changing the way that you work with other people. And again, I'm just going to flick through these. I will describe this one because this is somebody, one of the student groups designed a kind of pair of binoculars made out of toilet rolls and put a piece of charcoal in one hole, and you can only see through the other one. And so they were really interested in how you might draw if you can only see the line after you've drawn it. And then they did some other things with that, which were really lovely. Another project we've done, again, just small. This is Naomi Lackmeyer again, Zoe Partington in the middle, who's my co-founder and is a partially sighted artist, and then John Adams on the left, who's autistic. And we were just asked to make a change to the Royal Academy in London, and we simply put in a pair of chairs into a very small space, a kind of double height space tucked behind the lift, with the idea that an escape space was actually really valuable to all sorts of people, particularly to autistic people, but had lots of uses. And that space just became occupied the whole time, just that small act, because in the Royal Academy as a museum and gallery, there was an idea that you shouldn't be able to sit down, that when you look at the work, you should stand up and kind of contemplate it. And where there are benches, they're actually very uncomfortable. So just putting in some comfortable chairs made a huge difference to occupation. This is Aaron Williamson again, who I showed you right at the beginning, as a deaf artist, and he's really interested in, he's a live artist, and he's got a really great kind of crip burlesque humor, I guess. As a student, there were no accommodations made for him, so he would sit in lectures and not be able to hear anything. And he found that incredibly hilarious, because he was just watching people perform but not knowing what they were saying. And one of the pieces that he's developed since is called the Collapsible Lecture, where he just plays with the everyday experience of sitting in a lecture. I know we're not doing it at the moment, but you all will have had that experience, and the kind of rules of the game, the way that you behave, the way that you know that you have to sit down and be in often uncomfortable chairs, that you have to be quiet, and that there are certain moments when you're allowed to say something. And what Aaron does is he does all sorts of the lecture never gets going, because he's really interested in how long it will take people before they actually break those rules of the game. And it usually takes between 20 and 25 minutes before somebody just decides they're going to get up because nothing has happened. And he's done a project very recently with us at the Architectural Association with Manijay Vagassi and Inigo Mins. This is a picture of the studio with Aaron on the left-hand side, laughing like he often does, with a group of students. And that was partly the aim of the studio, was to do a completely different sort of architectural project that didn't have to be a piece of designed work. And this was one of the pieces. It shows 3 students dressed up in very peculiar pink and yellow and black outfits. But all of this was done. There was also a really strong and rich portfolio of these very different sorts of pieces of work. Very definitely breaching, from my point of view, really challenging the nature of what a design project is in education. Here's another one where I'm very interested in different sorts of representation. This is by a student from Newcastle called Greg Morrell for his diploma project. And he was actually really interested in queer space and how he might express queer space in his drawings, but he was also really interested in crip space. And so he used these kind of surrealist maquettes to mannequins to express that kind of, to deliberately disrupt the nature of the drawing, the orthographic drawing. And this is a project I absolutely love by Thomas Carpentier, which was his diploma project in France, where he started from a whole range of different bodies, some fictional, some real. So kind of the Borg Queen, Arnold Schwarzenegger, Alice in Wonderland. And he designed a villa for them to live together. At the bottom, you can see a picture of a plan looking down on a table with 5 people on one side and 4 on the other. This is, so this is where it started really, is what would the design of that table look like and the different ways of sitting as people shared a meal. This is a picture showing that, and then that became this completely well-realized project, which you can find on his website, which is full of the most interesting, creative, but also disruptive details. And finally, in this section, I wanted to talk about a project that we've been involved in now for, would have been the 3rd year if we'd been able to run it, called Architecture Beyond Sight. This is a project at the Bartlett UCL, which was started before I started working there. And it was commissioned by the Dean. The Dean was really interested in how not just that you could get more blind and visually impaired people into architecture, sort of make them fit, but that actually starting from designing, from blind and visually impaired people designing, was a really interesting way of challenging how the visual was so dominant in the design professions, in the architecture and interior professions, and that the different sorts of design methods and the different ways of representing and describing space, particularly with a very strong sensory underpinning, could be potentially something very interesting that could challenge mainstream education. So this is Carlos Pereira, who is a Portuguese architect who is blind. And he was showing us, we had quite a long development period working with, so it was disability led by blind and visually impaired tutors, and right from the kind of development stages, and then it was taught entirely by blind and visually impaired tutors. So that's Carlos and some of his work. This is a picture of a whole group of people sitting around a table, which is a mixture of blind and visually impaired artists, mainly sighted architects, although Carlos there is a blind architect, working together to develop this course. This is a picture of four people, Carlos sitting down on the left-hand side, and then three women, Mandy Redvers-Rowe, Lynn Cox, and Rachel Gadsden, standing up and looking at him. In front of him is a model, and they're using touch to discuss this scheme because they're all blind and visually impaired. Here we have Rachel and one of the sighted architects working together. Rachel does very large body-sized drawings. And there she is again. This is Chris Downey, who's a blind architect from the States, working with a couple of students last year, no, the year before last, because it's last year we weren't able to run it. This picture shows, so the students made work using a whole lot of different materials based on touch and a variety of colors. This is a kind of Lego model with some pipe cleaners that somebody used and some tissue. Here we have Mandy and Shadi Abdul, a sighted architect, who worked together on a design project, and they're here in this picture. They're using Lego, but they actually described the project to everybody else through a kind of audio description and performance. So they basically performed what the new space would be like, which was completely wonderful because you could imagine it. You could imagine exactly what they meant. And here we have Mandy again, working in the workshop. Half the group made boxes called, we called them a box of feelings. And part of this was making the workshop more accessible and more willing to, and feeling less frightened of having blind and visually impaired people there. We had a really fantastic blind craftsman from Tasmania called Duncan Murding. And here he is with one of the students and the box that she made, which is very beautiful. This is a picture of another student's box, which used kind of perforated metal to give a, diffract the light. This student used different types of wood to get different sorts of quality of experience within her box. And this shot shows one of the reviews of the student's work happening on the ground under a table, so that the light in it was more noticeable to the one of the tutors who is visually impaired in that case. So what's my last big claim? This one I feel is just quite underdeveloped, and I'd be really interested to hear what people had to say, and it may be something that you know more about than me, because a lot of it is coming out of the States. So it is, instead of thinking of access and inclusion as these kind of technical solutions that are added on at the end of a project, there's a real move towards thinking about access. I've mentioned love already, but as something that's a kind of collective and emergent form of care. It's about us looking after each other. It's a process. It's not a set of things. It's not like a ramp and a platform lift. It's an ongoing emergent process where the complexity of different people's needs, we all work together to meet those and to adapt spaces after they've been built. And we know that we're never going to get it all right, but it's a willingness to do that. It's a commitment to do that. I recommend that you look at this project, Access is Love. It's Maya Mingus, Alice Wong and Sandy Ho. It's called the Disability Visibility Project. They're really fantastic. Anyway, and Maya Mingus, this is a picture of Maya Mingus giving a talk. She also has a website called Leaving Evidence. And she's been talking about something she calls access intimacy. So she's talking about what is the process by which people can support each other in all their different ways of being in the world in a way that is equitable and not divisive. Desiree Valentine has written a piece called, which is quite theoretical, but it's called Shifting the Weight of Inaccessibility. So shifting the weight from disabled people to all of us, which I think is just a really interesting notion. And I mentioned care work before. Dreaming Disability Justice is the subtitle of this book. For me, this is fantastically interesting work around just really moving beyond the notion of care as this kind of contractual relationship where, you know, disabled people or old people or need looking after, and the carers. So there's an active passive relationship, and instead seeing it as a much richer and more complex set of collective interactions and interdependencies. So this is quite a big thing. I think what I'm saying is we really need to change the way we think about and the way we make care as a much richer thing, something central. I started talking about disability and about access, but the notion of rethinking care and maintenance and repair, all those kinds of words which are being, people are discussing, seems to me to be something that when we're in the design disciplines, we should be engaging with that material. And actually it's still not happening. It's still happening in a completely different place. And it's so much of it really touches on what designers do, what interior designers do, what architects do, what other built environment professionals do. It's really important that we engage with this material. I'm quite academic, so I'm suggesting some books here. They may not work for you. The Question of Access by Tanya Tiskowski is just a fantastic introduction and a very good read. Building Access by Amy Hamray, who's a really vital scholar. And
we're slowly losing you. Oh, you're back. Oh, but we can't.
hi there, I got kicked out, did I?
Yes, but you're back.
I'm back, but I'm pretty well finished. So
Josh, your narrative about the books that you were suggesting, it was lost a bit. If you would be so kind to repeat that part. When you begin to introduce the books, your voice won't.
okay, yeah, I could see that I was being booted out.
At least I'm interested in this.
Are we all right for time?
Yeah, we are good. So you have a few more minutes to complete. Yeah.
Okay, I'll do that because you can't see the time when you're in the. So let's go back and see if we can get to that and if I can stay with you.
Yes.
So the books I was talking about, Question of Access by Tanya Tiskowski, fantastically rich, really good introduction, should be something that everybody in the design professions and education reads. It's a joy. It's also quite funny. Building Access by Amy Hamray, who's one of the leading scholars really in disability studies and universal design. It's the first book to actually treat access as a socially constructed issue and to look at the nuances of how we come to have the building code that we have, again in with really thorough archival research. And then I'll talk about one more book on this screen, which is Accessible America by Bess Williamson, which Bess has been working for a very long time on all the different kind of objects and devices that disabled people have created or had created for them as a kind of, again, as a design history, which still, I mean, David Serlin's also doing some fabulous work in this area, but generally it's still very empty. It's not, finding out about disability history is still very empty. The books that I would really recommend, again, a really great read, is What Can a Body Do? It's literally just come out. It's by Sarah Hendren, How We Meet the Built World. And she talks to, it's a personal account, and it's very engaging with different sorts of ways of designing. Making Disability Modern, it's very, again, Bess Williamson, but with Elizabeth Guffey, is a series of short pieces about how one might think about disability and difference as a way of looking at the histories and even the theories of our discipline. And Disability Visibility, I mentioned the Disability Visibility Project, but that's just a really fabulous book of personal narratives. I think one of the things I say to everybody is, if people are often quite anxious, if you're non-disabled and you don't have disabled friends or relatives, then people will admit to being quite anxious or fearful around disabled people, like not really knowing what to say or do. And I would say, first of all, you know, the obvious one, see the person, not the disability. But I think also, you know, I started out by just with making connections to people on social media. So I was hearing very diverse disabled voices, creative disabled voices, all the time in my Twitter feed or in my Facebook pages. And that's really, I find that very enjoyable and enlivening. And just listening to these first person stories, there's so much knowledge out there, which again, somehow never percolates into our area. So that is my last slide. Obviously, I should be plugging my books, The Reader, Disability Space Architecture, and the earlier work, Doing Disability Differently, which I would probably write a bit differently now, but still I think has some key points. DisOrdinary Architecture has a Vimeo channel. We have quite a lot of just quite short videos of the different projects that we've done. And there are other things, I can share this slide or I can share the whole presentation. There are other things which I think helps explain this better, including the intersections between this and a kind of feminist approach. So thank you. I'm done.
Thank you very much. Oh, I'm having trouble getting back on screen. Okay, thank you. Thank you. This was really, really great. And I highly recommend for all of you who are attending to watch some of the videos that were on that last slide, showing in more details or kind of or in action some of the project that were presented. So if you were excited by what you saw, I highly recommend that, watching them. So we have, as I said, please share your questions in the Q&A. I'll let you talk and ask your questions directly. So we already have a question from Paulina, so I'm allowing you to talk. Here you go.
Hello.
Hi, Paulina.
Hi, I just wanted like a general question. So what do you think is like the source of your inspiration?
I think it's a really interesting question, because I think it's funny when I get asked questions like that, I always say, well, I think it's Zoe Partington. It's like meeting Zoe, this visually impaired artist, back in 2007, just over tea. And she'd already done so much work around access and inclusion, but she also had this really, and she's very practical. She's very much, I'm the theorist and the kind of academic, and she's the really like, well, you have to do that. And why, it's really obvious you should do this. But just to see that there was energy in this area, just to see that there was a kind of liveliness, and that what to me had been a bit of a kind of academic, like, why do we not treat disability in such a weird way? It kind of opened all sorts of doors for me. And then I don't know if this is the answer inspiration, but I think it is the disabled artists I work with. We have maybe 25 quite regularly, and then probably, you know, a wider group of another 10 or 15 and that we could call on, and then others that we're beginning to get involved because we're trying to always widen the range. And they're very different. Their creative practice is very different. A lot of the discussions we have are about the difference between the creative practice of artists and the creative practice of architects and interior designers. So it's not about disability at all, but it kind of intersects. So for me, just working with those people was just so much more energizing than, you know, some of my, and I should say this really quietly, some of my colleagues at work within the architectures of the discipline, because it felt like something that it's very insular on the whole. I mean, maybe yours isn't, you know, where you're studying or where you're tutoring, but for me, it's weirdly, it's sort of self-framing, and just to meet people from outside the academy and the discipline. And I think then that also introduced me to disability studies scholars and to disability activists, and to read their work and to listen to their talks. I was just blown away. I was just blown away with a whole set of things I'd never thought about, and a kind of the notion that, you know, disabled people are passive and don't really have anything to say, and, you know, need looking after, and that they're kind of, you know, they make us all terribly nervous. It's just kind of, it was like this whole new thing for me, and it was exciting and continues to be exciting. And I mean, what's been great about DisOrdinary Architecture Project, there was a whole patch when we had the Paralympics in London in 2012, when a lot of the artists got quite major commissions. And I actually worked in Moscow for a few years. And so nothing happened for 2 or 3 years. And then when I came back and said, does anybody want to go on doing this? It was like, everybody was like, yes, of course we do, because we have such fun. And the idea of connecting disability, difference and fun was like, you know, I'm repeating myself, but yeah, so that's my answer, I think, Paulina.
Thank you. We have an anonymous attendee, so I'll read for them, who is asking, what are your thoughts on disabled individuals' unique experiences or struggles with shelter-in-place lockdown orders with COVID-19?
Sorry. I mean, there's two things here, isn't there? There's one about unique individual experiences, and I know that there are, you know, that there are many really difficult experiences that people are having. I think so I can't talk for all those people, especially as a non-disabled person, but what I can talk about is what my kind of network is saying. Mm-hmm. And part of that is, yes, the kind of, the way in which, I mean, I don't know what's happening with you, but with us, there's a kind of, you know, it was immediately like, oh, well, if you're fit and well, you'll be fine. You know, if you've got an existing condition and if you're vulnerable, then, you know, it'll probably kill you, but, you know, well, bad luck. So there was a kind of division between an assumption that fitness, youth, you were completely invincible, which of course isn't quite true, and that, you know, these other people like the elderly and the disabled, you know, that they could just kind of die, really. We could just shunt them off, that their lives were less valuable. And for a lot of disabled people that I know, that just reinforces what is the standard assumption, which is somehow you're less valuable if you're not productive in society. Somehow you're a drain on society. So I think it has been really problematic, and certainly again in the UK, like with the rollout of the vaccine, they have started with old people, but they have not been prioritizing people with disabilities in a way that I think is very discriminatory. But at the same time, a lot of people are really like sort of hilariously angry. I mean, they're funny in their anger about the fact it's like, we've been saying for years, you know, make it possible to do some work remotely. You know, we've been living like this for years. And now all you non-disabled people are struggling with it. You're like completely shocked, and you don't realize that this is the life that you know, if you make inaccessible built environments, that's the life you're giving to disabled people. that's the life you're leaving them with if you can't get out, if you can't get about. So they're kind of like, we know all about this, we've already done it.
Mm-hmm.
And when we asked for remote working, we weren't allowed. And now that non-disabled people can work remotely, it's great. You know, they think it's kind of completely allowable. So I think there were some things, there were kind of some interesting ripples. So I'm not talking about particular individuals or their experiences, but I think there are really interesting ripples about how this plays out, how we should be using it as a way of recognizing that we should value everyone. Because I work quite a lot in Australia, you know, a lot of the indigenous peoples locked down very early, and that's because they were protecting their elders and they were protecting the wisdom and the knowledge that elders are seen to embody, which is a kind of completely different attitude, isn't it, to ours about, well, if you're old, you're basically worthless. So, sorry, long answer, but really interesting question. And I think there's a lot out there. A lot of people are writing about this, and maybe something we can, I think it's something we need to learn from, again, learn from the experience of disabled people.
Yeah, and it completely ties into the basis of the DisOrdinary project in a way. Like what you're saying is that it just reinforces this. So
Yeah, absolutely.
We have a question from Kalani, so I'll let you talk. Yeah.
Hi there, can you hear me?
Yes.
Awesome, okay. I really enjoyed the portion of your presentation where you spoke about language and terms that have been used to describe disability in design and how you've rejected or turned away from some of those terms. How does language play into breaching during the creative process, whether your own or the teams you've been on?
Cool, thank you, Kalani. That's a really interesting question, because I think I only talked very briefly about breaching, and the notion of breaching, which actually comes from a theory called ethnomethodology, but it's been used in lots of different ways as well, is that we all societies, and then smaller groups within societies, have their own set of rules, their own way of speaking, their own habits and routines. And that what's very interesting about that is they're kind of completely unnoticed until somebody breaches them, until somebody sort of doesn't do what you're meant to do. And then actually all sorts of people get very upset, or they might start policing the situation. So suddenly things go from being completely quote unquote normal to being kind of really ruptured and disrupted. And language is, using language differently, I think, is a really quite an interesting part of that. One of the projects I did, building on the work of DisOrdinary, but actually on my own, was in Montreal with at a university there, a week-long design project. And we did breaching projects, which was in this public square. And one of the students' groups did this absolutely lovely project, which is around the notion of liking and Facebook and judging people by their appearance. And so they sat in a row outside the metro stations, people coming out, and they gave people scores. And then to see how they responded, which is obviously quite a kind of very breaching thing to do. But then they kind of self-breached in that they thought that this was actually like the kind of making judgments about people by their appearances was actually really, like, why did we do it? It's a really terrible thing to do, and we do it all the time. So then they started doing a different technique, which was about them, they still did it in public, but it was about them judging, about writing notes and judging, kind of reflecting on what they were thinking. So it flipped over from being a kind of play on language and on social media to being a self-reflective exercise. It became a completely different thing. So I guess I could just give so many examples about breaching. I think it's a really useful tool in the design field.
Yeah. Beth, you are next.
Hi there. I'm doing my thesis on wayfinding for the blind and visually impaired. And I'm interested in if you know any particular designers or buildings that share information with the blind or visually impaired in a unique or interesting way.
Hi, Beth. Yeah, I mean, and this may be somebody you've come across because Chris Downey was a consultant on a lighthouse for the blind in San Francisco. Do you know that project? Maybe
Yeah, I'm aware of Downey, the
Yeah.
architect.
So I think Chris Downey is just a really, because what's great about Chris Downey is, for me, sorry, what's great about Chris Downey is that he, when he lost his sight, it was obviously, that's very challenging. He'd been working as an architect, and so it's a challenging thing, but quite quickly, I think he felt like it was opening up a whole new way of being in the world and of seeing the world. And he's really enjoyed that. He said that he now thinks he's a better architect because he takes such a lot of notice of so many detailed things. He's really lovely the way he talks about how he uses his cane. And, you know, you don't really think about, if you see somebody who uses a white cane, you don't really think about what they're actually doing. But for him, it's like this extraordinary arm extension. It's just, and about feeling space as he goes through it. So I would say that partly because I really like his attitude, and I think that the notion of that building, the client was also really interesting, is that they redefine wayfinding in a much richer way than it just being a kind of function, you know, like, as you probably know, you know, wayfinding can often be like, okay, if you're blind, how do you get from A to B? You don't have to enjoy it, but it's like, how do you do it mechanically? And they're really interested in it, how it makes something beautiful. And Mandy Redvers-Rowe, who I've mentioned, who's a writer and a theatre producer and is blind, uses a guide dog. She's really interested in beauty. And she's really fantastic to talk to about how she, so I don't think she'd even call it wayfinding, although she does need to wayfind, of course, but she's really interesting about how she engages with built space. And I can give you a contact for her via Olivier if you want to. The other person I think who you may have come across, who I think's brilliant, is Rod Machalko. Do you know him? Have you heard of Rod?
No, I do not.
I
do not.
Cool. I mean, he's a blind person, but who writes very creatively about his blindness and has written several books. Machalko is spelled Michalko. And he's just a joy to read again. So this may be beyond what you want to look at, but I think there's lots of really good work by blind and visually impaired people talking about their experiences of built space, which sometimes is better than talking to the architects, who are already very embedded in the kind of standard ways of doing it.
I think we have a few more minutes for the last two questions. So Holly, you are next.
Hello. Yes. Can you
Holly?
hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. You briefly mentioned a feminist approach to disability in architecture towards the end there. I was wondering if this would take a different form from movements such as DisOrdinary, as you described, and if so, what would those differences or outlooks be?
I think that's a really good question, and I am going to give a short answer, but it is that I think that for us is, for me, I'm going to say for me, are kind of the next steps, which is to think about where the overlaps, but also the difficulties and nuances are between gender, disability, race, sexuality, but not as these kind of functional divisions, because obviously, you know, a lot of people are all of those different things. There's a really interesting book. I'm academic, so you always get books from me, by Alison Kafer, K-A-F-E-R, called Feminist Queer Crip. It might be Queer Feminist Crip, or, but it's really, again, very, very good at kind of knitting together those different issues. And I think within the DisOrdinary Architecture Project, it's there in the range of artists that work with DisOrdinary, but in terms of us really unraveling how that affects our practice and how it affects our ideas about changing modes of practice in architecture, we haven't pushed it forward. There is a video, the talk at the University of Melbourne, which I'll give Olivia a link to, which is on that last slide, is me talking about the relationship between the work I did at Matrix and the work I did with DisOrdinary. So that might answer your question better.
Okay, we actually have one more question that I thought, and I think it's a really, really strong one. So I'll ask the last two questions that are anonymous. So the first one is, well, thank you, Dr. Boyes. And how can we use design spatial justice for the homeless population? Have you had any projects regarding this subject?
We haven't, although interestingly, there's a bit of an overlap because the projects that we have been doing, which relate to being able to lie down in public, very much overlap with the needs of homeless people to find places to be safe and rest. So it's not an area we've looked at. I think there is some very good work. Christoph Vadichku's homeless vehicle. I mean, I think there is stuff out there. We have a really clear remit, which is how does the architecture and built environment and interiors professions and education need to change? So there's a kind of scope, and that's probably beyond our scope, but it's a really great question.
And the final question, I love the idea of crib time and feel that concept sort of applies to everyone within the constraint of COVID and lockdown. I'm curious about appropriation and whether non-disabled people using concepts and terms like that would be welcome. Yeah.
That's a completely fantastic last question because I worry about that too. And because I mix with a lot of disabled people, I find myself using expressions like crib space kind of without thinking. And then everybody around me, if they're non-disabled, kind of goes like that. And in a way, they're right, just as and I should be maybe more thoughtful. For me, it's always about making sure that you reference the source. I think the issue of appropriation as a non-disabled person is always an issue, but it also can't stop you trying to be an ally. It doesn't mean that you won't get it. You'll get it wrong sometimes. And so for me, when I talk about crib time, what I want to do is always be referencing and using the words of disabled people and diverse disabled people who may interpret crib time very differently, use their words and reference them very well and make sure that I'm pointing my audiences at their work, making sure that I'm not claiming it as mine. So that would be that's how I deal with it, but it might not be, I'm open.
To refer to the last question by Olivier, when he asked that question, I was reminded of your point one. Can you hear me? Oh, okay. Because in your discovery, the point one, when you spoke about the experience led by disabled people and their capacity to share their knowledge, I think the only way to learn from them is that they are part of these teams sharing their knowledge, an appropriation as if it's a knowledge that they are leading and we are learning from them. So it becomes more a question of knowing how to learn, right? So it seems to me that I just guess the last question by Olivier brought me to the beginning of the lecture, and I just wanted to thank you so much. But Olivier will close, and it was such. I think I'm speaking on behalf of so many individuals that heard you today. This lecture has been very important for me. Thank you so very much.
You're very welcome. And what's the next steps? The next steps are, that as tutors you should be, you know, inviting in disabled artists, and not just one. I mean, I know we have to finish, but we've been working with quite a famous design practice in London who are actually really rethinking the whole way that they operate, and around disability, inclusion and sustainability as a kind of whole, and not just tick box. I'll talk about it another time. The reason I mention it is they have a regular lecture series from disabled artists. And initially, the first one, you know, I organised, and then the second one, they were like, oh, we can organise this, Joss. Just give us a few names and we'll organise it. We'll talk to those people about. And that to me was just perfect. It was like, I didn't need to be a mediator. They were comfortable enough about the value of having disabled artists talking about their creative practice and being able to think about how to apply that to their design work, and to do the briefing, to be completely in control of the whole thing. And that for me is just like, that's the next step. It's not me as a non-disabled person talking about this. It's you inviting in the brilliant disability scholars, artists, activists you have in the States. You know, just, it's where the best work is happening. So really worth making use of.
Thank you. Well, yeah, I think that's a really great end. Thank you for being that mediator today and introducing a lot of these people to, and as you say, wonderful artists who are doing incredible work. And I think kind of the final words that you add about kind of, I mean, amplifying their voices, but not necessarily talking for them, but kind of being just one person who transmits some of these ideas, but going back to the experience and being able to learn from the disabled people who are challenging the way that we think about the built environment. I hope everyone here kind of learned from that experience. And again, thank you for joining us. And I'll end by inviting everyone to join us in 3 weeks on March 24th for the lecture by Gustavo Carmona, joining us from Mexico City. So again, somewhere else in the world, bringing in some ideas to us in Arizona. So thank you, everyone, and have a good rest of the afternoon in studio or taking some time off to think about these ideas. So, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks for having me. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Okay.